Our next panel is focused on the future of democracy assistance. I am pleased to welcome on stage Shanthi, Kalathil, board member at the National Democratic Institute, Daniel Twining, president of the International Republican Institute, and Damon Wilson, president and CEO of the National Endowment for Democracy. Moderating today's panel is Bonnie Glick, who formerly served as deputy administrator and COO at USAID.
Thank you, everyone. We have a stellar panel today from across the democracy spectrum supporting democracy, and we're going to talk about the state of democracy around the world this morning. Damon, Dan, Shanthi, thank you. What I wanted to do is start with some general questions for all of you, and then we'll do some targeted questions. So a list of questions that we want to think about. Are digital technologies, particularly AI, supporting a new era of democracy or authoritarianism around the world? Second question, how is the United States doing in handling these new developments? And finally, how are your organizations, the NED, NDI, IRI, how are you adapting to the technological changes around the world, particularly in partner nations where you work? Shanthi, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Bonnie. Thank you so much to the team at SCSP for hosting us here today. I'm so delighted to see that you've really centered these issues in the conversation, not just with this panel, but throughout the day. And I look forward to hearing from the other speakers on these issues. Let me take a stab at answering these questions by setting them in a little bit of context, and that's based partly on my own experience. I first started looking at these questions roughly 20 years ago, a little bit more than that. And at that time, you have to cast yourself back to that time. People were so enthusiastic about technology, the World Wide Web, right? We were so excited about everything that this could bring. And at that time, people weren't really interested in hearing a lot about the ways in which authoritarian governments might seek to utilize these technologies for their own aims and their own advantages. Over the years, however, as democracies and authoritarian countries became more intertwined, technology itself helped bring these types of systems closer together. And inasmuch as we wanted to make sure that democratic values prevailed around the world, technology itself actually, in some cases, allowed those values to flow both ways. And in many ways, these political systems became more and more intertwined. And at the heart of that sat technology. Over the years, I think we've come to understand that the future of democracy assistance, and really the future of democracy itself, is in some way dependent on this hinge, which is technology. Our political systems are ever more dependent on it. The way that we live our lives, it's hard to think of an aspect of our societies and our political systems, just everything about the way we govern ourselves, that's not dependent in some way on technology. So it's an incredibly important question. And I want to stress that in recent years, we've really grappled with this. What we've seen a lot of is governments taking this very seriously. And obviously, we've seen corporations taking this very seriously. And we have a lot of conversations today that center on the role of both of those players. But I would like to take a moment to highlight the third aspect, the third prong of this triangle, if you will, which is society, civil society around the world. If you don't have civil society involved in these conversations about how technology is developed, how it's governed, how it can best play a role in upholding democratic values and making sure that democratic processes function, then we're missing a key element. So I'm really glad that we're having this conversation today, and we're going to hear later today from important folks in civil society about the ways that they're utilizing technology in their own work. So to get to your question about how NDI sees these issues and how it can best take advantage of these developments in technology, I think the way NDI would approach it is to center not necessarily just the technological tools themselves, but the actual processes of democracy, relying on those core values of transparency, accountability, participation, and inclusion to guide use of technology, and more importantly, to help partners overseas really harness these technologies in their own work to uphold democracy and liberal values. So NDI works at a couple of levels, but I would say one is the broad normative level, trying to shape the governance processes around technology, the way that it is actually developed, the way that international institutions and multilateral and multi-stakeholder processes shape the way technology develops. And the other level is actually on the ground, helping partner organizations in their own work. And these organizations and these individuals, these activists on the ground, are the ones that know best how they can use advanced technology to further their own work. So for instance, NDI supports, along with others in the NED family, a group of internet activists called the Open Internet Leaders. And they work on the ground in their own countries to make sure that their laws and regulations are ones that best shape technology in a way that is most conducive to democratic values and democratic processes. NDI also makes sure that activists are equipped with the best cybersecurity tools, with the best knowledge. It runs trainings on the ground for these folks, and it particularly seeks to lift up the voices of marginalized and women in the conversation. And NDI has a particular program that focuses on online violence against women, because it understands that when women are excluded from the political conversation because of harassment and cyber attacks, all of democracy suffers. So those are a few ways in which NDI engages, both at the normative level and also at the grassroots level. But again, centering democratic processes in the conversation, not necessarily focusing only on the technology.
Shanthi, thank you so much. Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you for your thoughts on digital technologies, AI. Is it supporting democracy, or is it having the opposite impact and supporting authoritarian rule?
Thank you, Bonnie. Pleasure to be here with all of you. I so appreciate the work of the Special Competitive Study Project. I like the framework of thinking about competition and thinking about the role of technology in framing the future competitive environment in which America and the free world can thrive. I like and agree with what Shanthi said, so let me just extend the point, maybe by suggesting a way to slice up the issue and the question, Bonnie. At IRI, we think about the opportunities. Of course, there are also dangers and challenges, but we think about four big buckets. One, of course, is supporting internet freedom, right? This has become a bit of a pipe dream, given where we started with our great dreams about the internet as a leveling, open platform for everybody in the world. But in fact, the role of democracies in ensuring that there is an architecture of internet freedom in the world, even if it's contested, even if it doesn't apply everywhere, is really quite fundamental to the future of open society. So internet freedom is first. The second basket is information integrity, right? Making sure democracy actually does not work. Open societies are not sustainable if there is no fact-based conversation, if there are all sorts of malign forms of propaganda, disinformation, etc., floating around, really poisoning public discourse. So we care a lot about information integrity as a second conceptual theme when we approach these issues. The third is countering foreign authoritarian influence. We've seen very aggressive and ambitious attempts by foreign powers, not just China and Russia, but also Iran and others, to really shape the information ecosystem in so many countries, far beyond their own shores, in really quite malign and malignant ways. So countering foreign authoritarian influence in the digital domain is also very fundamental to the future of freedom when we think about technology applications. And then finally, and I know we want to talk more about this, Bonnie, I know you're talking about it more here today, but rather than simply playing defense, thinking we have to hold on to what we've got, we really need to think about building digitally native democracies, right? We really have to think about leveraging, frankly, in a mirror image of the way that, for instance, the Chinese Communist Party has built the world's most sophisticated surveillance state using these tech tools. We need to think about using our open systems to deliver for citizens using digital technologies. There are some interesting examples of this from Estonia and India, from elsewhere, that I know we'll be talking about, but we really do need to have a positive agenda. It's very easy in these conversations to slip into defense mode, we've got to offer something better. And if we can make democracy, make digital democracy work for citizens, that in itself enhances our competitive advantages in the competition.
We're getting cheers from the audience for those of you who are in the virtual community. And Dan, I think with very good reason, the idea that we are on our back foot really shouldn't be the position from which we get started. It should be where we see competition. And looking at the mission of the Special Competitive Studies Project and bringing together government, civil society, and the private sector to have these conversations, there's no one better to bring it all together than Damon. Give us your thoughts on, from the NED perspective, the National Endowment for Democracy, what are the ways to use these new tools to create more digitally native democracies?
Terrific. Thank you so much, Bonnie. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. And for Bonnie, who has brought this perspective into all of the work that you've done throughout your career, Shanthi helped lay the groundwork for much of what NED strategy we're beginning to deliver on now when she helped run our in-house think tank, and the programs of NDI and IRI have been out front in figuring out how do we actually go on offense to leverage democracy, to leverage technology for democracy. And so you asked Bonnie about this in this sort of this new era of competition. And I think the Summit has done a really important job of putting this in the context of competition, but embedding the concept of democracy at the heart of the discussions today. Because it is the openness of our societies, it is democratic societies that embrace decentralization, innovation, entrepreneurship, that give us a leg up in trying to figure out how do we actually leverage technology for democracy? How do we counter digital authoritarians? And I think the task that we're really trying to think through, fundamentally, how do you put democratic principles at the base of creating a digital future so that it works for the broadest group of citizens around the world? And I think that is a North Star that guides a lot of our programming, a lot of our principles, because we are in a very competitive spirit. I like to think of it as Democrats being challenged by autocrats rather than just democracies versus autocracies, because we have so many democratic allies, people that believe in these values, billions around the world, many who live under these authoritarian regimes. And we do have to face the reality that it's a tough time. We're not only in the 18th year of a democratic recession, it is technology, it is an evolving information environment that has made this a sharper competition, a more challenging competition for Democrats around the world, for partners around the world. We see it through Russian measures to prevent the truth about their atrocities in Ukraine from reaching the Russian people, or North Koreans trying to keep their population ignorant so that the ability to think critically is denied to average North Koreans. We see this in Iran, now the use of facial recognition technology to identify women without wearing a hijab on the street that could be picked up later. We've seen it in Belarus, protesters identified through facial recognition, arrested subsequently. And of course, in China, the embrace of an approach to artificial intelligence, which tries to substitute centrally CCP-controlled social engineering for the voices of people. And you layer that with sort of the ethnic tagging that we've seen and being able to identify Uyghur populations through this technology. There is a pathway to a dystopian future that the autocrats are mapping. But it's our task to leverage our society's strength of openness and innovation to develop that counterpoint. And I think that's what we're doing. That's what you've heard from Shanthi and from Dan, that our organizations understand this isn't just game as usual, it's sort of game on. So it's not just a new era for how we think about the challenge, it needs to be a new era in democracy support, where we understand that the biggest shift is that we are really trying to support partners around the world in a very hostile environment. And so we've been leaning in at the Endowment on how to think about technology for accountability and monitoring. And you see this in millions of ways around the world, whether it's Nigerians that jump ahead of their government by moving government data into sort of digitally available material. We've seen partners in Paraguay being able to track government expenditures in a way that expose lost and stolen funds from people in rural communities. We've also really invested quite a bit in technology for communication and organizing. I think this is key to so many of our partners We just did a board meeting at the Endowment with many of our Burmese partners, some joining from Rangoon, from inside Burma, some from the border, and to watch how the National Union Government convenes cabinet through secure video conferencing. The ability to organize securely has been a huge, huge effort for many of our partners. Even active civic life in Egypt because of the security to be able to do so. And finally, I think really leaning in on how technology is there for maintaining the resilience of so many of our partners so that they are able to protect themselves, they are able to stay in the fight. So we felt like we were on our back foot, Bonnie. This turbocharge in technology turned the sharper repression of what was a democratic recession into an assault on democracy. But now we're leveraging our strengths of openness, ingenuity, creativity to really figure out how we can go on offense with experiments. I like to think of it as venture capital for democracy and small experiments all around the world. How do we learn from that, connect the dots, accelerate democratic learning around our partners so that we can actually begin turning it in a way that we leverage this technology for democracy?
So, Damon, I'm going to stick with that for a second. You have a lot of experience, obviously, in this space. This stage is really an incredible collection of people with history of working in democracy and working across authoritarian systems, whether it's in Europe or East Asia or the Middle East. It's extraordinary. That's great when we look backwards. Let's think a little bit about lessons from the past that we've learned that can be infused in today's young people, because they are the ones who are going to be the users of technology, the creators of technology. What are the lessons from the past that we can turn to do better and help young people run through this race that we have to win?
You know, I think thinking about experiences from the past are important, even as the situation is fundamentally different. And when we were involved in beginning our careers, you could see a string of democratic successes. If you look at the 1990s, for nonviolent civil resistance movements, nonviolent protest movements, mass movements, and the 90s were about 64% successful in leading to transitions to democracy. And when they were peaceful, having a track record of sustaining that. By the 2010 onward, that dropped to around 30%. Dramatic. And this is a historic shift in this data from research that's been done for quite a period of time. And I think it relates to the sharpness and the rise of authoritarians turbocharged by technology and cash, able to sharpen repression at home, but increasingly committed to working together to export the tools and tactics and technologies of repression. Autocracy Inc., as Anne Applebaum has written. And so partly what we have to do is understand what were the ingredients of success in the past, as many of previous generations of activists succeeded in the third democratic wave, but is what has changed to make this different? There are a couple of other lessons, and one of them that I think our institutions try to own is this sense of humility. We've got a lot of smart people here in Washington in this conference working here, but a sense of humility to knowing that not all the answers and not all the strategies are going to be made around tables and conference rooms in Washington. It is the power of a decentralized approach of understanding how can we best support those who are being forced to adapt and innovate in their local circumstances, and being able to support that infrastructure. Where is there a way to learn with humility while also understand the reach that we do have? So, for example, the ability for us to support hubs of translators that take the lessons that are learned in certain places and dealing with technological challenges and putting them in languages across the world that can be more used and locally accessed by partners on the ground. And I think that understanding that nonlinear approach, that decentralized approach, connecting the power of so many experiments, this venture capital for democracy that can seed thousands of experiments around the world and people in different cultural contexts, but then understanding what we're learning from that and being able to connect the dots to roll out that learning across our partners.
Damon, I think that that's really vital to have a vision into where we were, where we're going, but also that element of humility that you spoke to, where we don't have a monopoly on great ideas in the United States, in Washington, D.C. I know that there are people who are here from all over the world, and I know we're being watched from all over the world. And we welcome ideas and questions. We also know that young people, as opposed to those of us on stage who self-identify as young people, young people are going to be the ones who generate the lion's share of the innovations that are coming forward in the months and years to come. So with that, Dan, and with that element of humility in place, how can the United States and our like-minded partners deploy tools, tech tools, to support democratic movements in contested states? This is hard work. We're not always going to be the leaders on this. Will it be enough to counter other malign influences that you were talking about?
Alone, it will not, because of course we need to use all the tools of power and influence, not just things like small NGOs that those of us on stage run. So all the tools, we would like to be a small piece of that. I really like Damon's point, and I think it's worth emphasizing. It's not actually democracy the autocracy in the world, because some of our greatest democratic allies, small d democratic allies, are in countries like Venezuela and Burma and Iran and Belarus, right? These are people who want to live in open, modern, technologically connected societies. I was in Iraq last week. In Iraq, 70% of the population is under 35. And guess what? They want to live in a modern, open, technologically enabled society, not, an oil rentier state in which older generations hold on to power. That's true across the Middle East, and that's actually true across the world. I think we underestimate the fact that young people are not just entirely fluent in technology tools in terms of their daily life, but that actually they are going to be at the center of building digitally native democracies. They are also going to be at the center of resisting authoritarian usurpers. We have seen, for instance, extraordinary leadership, going to Bonnie's point about learning from others, from the Free Society of Taiwan, which has a very incredible civic tech community that is world-class in helping protect Taiwan's open society in the digital domain from authoritarian pressure and influence and information operations from China and the Chinese Communist Party. So there's a lot we can learn. We need to think much more creatively when we look at a tough problem set like Iran or Burma about empowering small d democrats with the technologies to help them level the playing field. It's easy to say, it's hard to do. Finally, Bonnie, I would just like to make the quick point, which is that Damon is right. Not only have peaceful civil resistance movements become harder to succeed because authoritarians have mastered the art of kind of high-tech repression, but in fact, many democracies have not delivered for citizens, right? So one reason we have had democratic backsliding here for the better part of 2 decades now is not simply because people are not voting for authoritarian solutions. Rather, they are expressing disappointment and maybe disconnecting from politics because small d Democrats take power and then do not deliver. So coming back to this very central point about helping democracy deliver, there are great examples of this, including in places where citizens historically have been disconnected. In Africa, in South Asia, where new digital tools implemented by governments are connecting citizens, producing government accountability, transparency, responsiveness, sometimes at very local levels, sometimes in very mundane ways about accessing government services. But if we can make democracy work digitally for young people, I think that's part of how we shift the balance of power, including in the more closed societies where young people really have a voice that's been entirely stolen.
Fantastic. From your mouth to democracy's ears. Shanthi, give us some ideas of different ways where we can use emerging technologies to increase access to opportunities in developing democracies. are there some examples from the work of NDI or your work that you'd like to share with us?
Sure. I mean, I think we've already heard some great examples from Damon and Dan about ways in which technology can be used to really further opportunity. I want to build on something that Dan said about having to show that democracy actually delivers. I think that's such a key point. And certainly it was something when I was in the administration, it was something that we tried to emphasize. And I really believe it now, which is you are going to lose support for democracy if people don't see it working for you. So some of the most interesting, I think, opportunities to make use of these new emerging technologies in developing democracies get to that specific point, which Dan just talked about. You know, in Ukraine now, there's an app called Dia, right? We've heard about this app, which is really part of enabling Ukrainians to get on with the business of their lives amidst wartime. And its amazing success in connecting citizens to their government has helped consolidate, in my view, the support for democracy, the strong support for democracy that you see in that population, because they see that technology can really work for them, can innovate, and can keep them connected and protected in such a volatile space. That, to me, is a really great example of how technology can really make democracy deliver and can help enable that kind of, not just support for technology, but support for democracy itself. You can see examples of this all around the world, and I think we've heard some examples of this already. I think even in the generative AI space, which I know, a lot of folks have talked about the potential downsides. I frequently talk about the potential downsides. I do think there are upsides. I think particularly, let's say in the fight against corruption, you could envision ways in which AI could be used to really crunch huge data sets, to really pry open closed information, to make things more transparent and accessible for journalists and for civil society to use, and crack down on corruption. I mean, I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head, but I'm sure there are folks out there that are actually innovating on the ground in these countries because they see a need for it. But I want to stress, this is not going to happen automatically or magically. If we believe that these are goods and that this is good for society, we have to actively push for these things through these types of organizations, certainly the organizations on stage that we represent, but more collectively, I think we have to foster the kind of innovation that we want to see, because it's not going to happen magically. There's no natural logic that will allow this to unfold in the way that we would like. So if we believe that technology can be good for democracy, then we have to push for that. And I might just add and maybe conclude with this, which is I was thinking a lot this summer. I always have to bring pop culture into anything that I do. And so this summer we know is the summer of Barbie and Oppenheimer, right? The Barbenheimer summer. And I feel like the conversation around emerging technology has focused a lot on the Oppenheimer side of the equation, which is how do we avoid that moment beyond which there's no return, the existential moment. And there's a lot of truth in that. I think we should be focused on those issues, certainly. But I think the conversation around democracy and technology is a little bit more towards the other side, the Barbie side of the spectrum, if you will, where we talk about how we want to live our lives. If we focus only on existential risk, we are missing this entire conversation around democracy and technology. And if we want to see more democratic outcomes, which I think we all want, on this stage and more broadly beyond, then we have to focus on that piece of it as well. And that means focusing on all these values that we've talked about, participation and transparency and accountability, and building those things into the technology so that we can get to those outcomes.
So in the spirit of Barbenheimer, we'll change the lighting in the room to be a hot pink because everybody looks good in that lighting. That's a fascinating way actually to look at it. The dark side, the light side, however you want to play it. One of the things that you raised is the Ukrainian software tool Dia, which is connecting Ukrainians across Ukraine, inside Ukraine, outside Ukraine, on the battlefront. And the hope, of course, is that when the battle is won, Dia will become the de facto method through which the Ukrainian government is able to offer services to its citizens, much along the same lines of Estonia or increasingly India and these digitally native societies. We're going to end our formal conversation on a positive note, so on a Barbie note. Let me ask each one of you for a one-word answer on what you're most excited about in a global emerging technology future. And when we're done with this, we have a little bit of time. We can open it up to the floor for questions. So, Shanthi, in a word, what are you most excited about in a global emerging technology future?
Very hard to limit to one word, but I guess I would say agency.
Okay, excellent. Dan.
Productivity, but I need to expand on that. I used to consult for the National Intelligence Council, which writes these wonderful reports looking out at the world 20 years ahead. And in the Global Trends 2035 report, which was produced around 2015, may have been Global Trends 2030, produced in 2010, my mind is getting fuzzy, but the prediction was for the first time in human history in the 2020s, we'll be living in a world that is broadly middle class, a world that is broadly composed not of a pyramid with a fancy tiny elite at the top and a broad base of impoverished souls below, but in fact, a world that looks like a diamond. Now, the pandemic and other things have slightly thrown that off. But if we can live in a broadly middle-class world that is empowered by technology, it's a game changer for governance, for prosperity, for all forms of opportunity. And that's the world we should be working
for productivity. Damon, your word.
I think I would say, in part because of the work we're embedded in right now, trying to figure out how to apply this in the real world, I'd use data casting. Data casting is a concept that's very inexpensive, off-the-shelf technology with receivers, where people, no matter where they are, often in very closed societies, through very simple technologies can actually gain access to libraries of independent information. And I see the opportunities as we deal with so many efforts to close off populations and citizens from information. I'm really excited about a new generation of circumvention tools. And Bonnie, before we go to Q&A, Shanthi just triggered me with she was talking about the example of how AI works. And we've seen this already in action in an incredible way, because we do support a lot of lower capacity grassroots groups around the world. What do they do in this environment? So we support hundreds of organizations that do investigative journalism, and oftentimes their market and audience is El Salvador. And yet, by working with higher capacity journalist groups and supporting their ability to use AI to plug in all of the work that hundreds of these investigative journalists do, you all of a sudden start to make the connections around transnational kleptocracy that you can't see when you look at it through Venezuela alone, El Salvador alone. And it is fueling things from Pandora Papers to others, in which everything that's been hidden to rob from people themselves is being forced into transparency. And we see this in action now. It's awesome.
That's quite amazing. Thank you. Thank you, all of you. Let's see if there are questions from the audience. And I see a hand right here up front, and we have mics that are circulating. Please tell us your name and where you're from. And remember, it's a question, it's not a statement. Right here, you have it. Hold on 1 second, ma'am, because it's hard to hear for the audience. Here we go.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm Dr. Gonzalez from CIFAI, which is Cognitive Insights for Artificial Intelligence. And I just have more than a question, just a comment from the last gentleman who indicate that in Iraq there is a lot of young people, but unfortunately, at the top is people too old, he says. My question is, how about here? Look at Congress and the Senate and the House. What are they doing? 80, 90-year-old people there? How about in universities? All the leadership, all dean, boss, all of them their prime time was in the 70s. They're still there. So if we look at everywhere, so please look at first home and then go outside I just had to do a comment because I see it. So what do you have to say about that?
It may be a question of, people self-identifying as youth, but Dan, did you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's a great point.
Yep. Next question. Way in the back. Getting our steps in. This is how we stay young.
Thanks so much. My name is Meg Platt, and I work with the German Marshall Fund. And I just had a question. We've actually had a lot of data coming out from our research at GMF regarding youth perceptions of democracy in the US and in Europe. And actually that support is waning, and that youth are more likely to have negative perceptions of the US, more likely to have positive perceptions of folks like China and Russia, are less convinced of the importance of NATO. And I know you talked about democracy delivering and how important that is. What are some steps we can take to convince this next generation in both the US and in Europe of the importance of democracy? Thanks.
Anyone want to take that one?
I'll
Shanthi,
take a short
perfect.
swinger. I suspect Damon wants to say something on that as well. But, you know, I think you've hit on a great point. And I would say I would go back to the point that I made earlier, which is we can't take this for granted. I think if young people are to remain engaged with democracy, they also have to see it delivering for them, and they have to see opportunities there. I think part of what we've been talking about a little bit is to show that technology can help maybe create some of those opportunities for folks. But it really is up to the folks who believe in democracy as a system to make that case that it's delivering for young people. And right now, you know, I share some of your concerns because I don't know that we are getting the messaging and that message right about democracy, because we feel like it's self-evident. If we see a pothole fixed on our road, we don't think, thank God for democracy, the pothole is fixed. You know, but there are ways to show that a well-governed, democratically governed system can actually help fix those potholes. You hear this most convincingly, interestingly, from local government representatives, from mayors on the ground. You know, we hear from mayors all the time in small cities in authoritarian settings who nonetheless are managing to deliver for people in their communities. It's that kind of connection with citizens that I hope will get young people engaged with democracy.
I might just add to what Shanthi said, because these are connected, important observations, concern about the perception, engagement, and agency of young people in so many societies, including our own. Some of this is really healthy. Democracies are meant to be self-correcting systems that when you're frustrated, irritated, upset, when you have concerns, you act. You don't sit back and wait. It's about the agency of people. And so I'm glad that young people aren't frustrated or aren't satisfied with the situation today. That's how we have built-in mechanisms to painfully, nonlinear, move open democratic societies forward. That doesn't happen in authoritarian states that really repress that don't allow sort of open public debate. The ability for us to identify problems in front of us, things that frustrate us, and mobilize into action to do something about it is the self-correcting, beautiful power of democracies. And if you think about even youth movements, civic movements, so many civic movements are actually youth-led. And they very rarely lead to a youth leader who is then enacting that as the new leader of a country or whatever it may be. Think about the civil rights movement, think about even anti-war movement, think about how things totally fundamentally shift the politics of a democratic society's political debate. And that is often the power of youth engagement to reframe the way political actors see what's possible as decisions. And we do see that impact over time. And it's a good thing that people in free societies are never quite totally satisfied, because that's how we're going to push ourselves to address problems and try to help fix things.
Well, I want to thank our incredible panel. Thank you so much to the Special Competitive Studies Project for having us here today to have this conversation on the future of democracy in the world of technology. And thank you all for being here today.
That's great.